Good morning. Um, this is particularly today is the 30th of October. 2 days ago in Mississippi, a truck carrying a bunch of rhesus monkeys flipped over, and warnings were put out that the monkeys were infected with a combination of herpes, COVID, and a third disease, which I can't remember off the top of my head. Um, and then the thing says that the monkeys were aggressive and they weren't to be approached. And then the story started. People had picked up that the story has started to change. And then they said, "Oh no, they weren't infected with anything." And it's even interesting because I was reading the account, which was from I think it was ABC or it might have been AAP, fairly mainstream organisation. And in one paragraph, it went from um, there was only one monkey unaccountable. And the next paragraph was they don't know how many monkeys were in the truck to begin with. So there are all these things that people are focusing on, going, "Well, let's say that means not adding up about the story." The thing that I think is really funny, though, is that these, and again, they said they don't know what they're saying, these monkeys have been used by Tulane experiment, but we're not sure what they've been used for or who they've been used for. So again, this weird reporting where one thing they tell you, oh, well, they're bought from this organisation, but we don't know where they're from. All very, very weird. But the focus again is on what I think is the story that everyone is missing so far is Tulane University basically have done a lot of money's been paid for them by the US Defense Department looking at infectious diseases. Very, very similar to what's going on in Nelson and Otago University and Auckland University with basically laboratories professing to be about countering infectious diseases, but the money actually also has very strange military overlaps and flies in the face of this whole thing of, like what is defensive can also be offensive. But okay, so Tulane University's got all these defence contracts. And there's three things where they've come up on the media in the past. The first one is that they were dealing with, again, US defence funded, making vaccines which were, in each of the cases, the ground zero for the Ebola, which broke out in 2014. Now, the Ebola broke out in 2014 in three separate countries. It was two strains of Ebola, which happened simultaneously. And the main organisation was being pumped out at the time was that the source of the infections being spread was from bats. Now, bats only have a range of about 80,000. And I'd actually discussed this with Francis Boyle, who was basically drafted a lot of the chemical and biological warfare legislation for the Bush administration and done stuff on behalf of Harvard University. And I interviewed him about this in about 2014, saying how the explanation didn't match up with what we know about how bats behave and how diseases spread. And namely, what we had was bats over here, 3,000 miles, disease outbreaks 3,000 miles away, nothing in between. Somehow magically got from there to there, even though bats only have a range of 80,000, 80 k's, not 80,000, 80 k's around. Now, the reason why that was mostly actually being spread by, that explanation was mostly being put out by a guy called Peter Daznak, who worked for the Ecohealth Alliance, and they were employed by the World Health Organization to track the spread of the disease and where it come from and where it was going, until the point that they got basically fired for incompetence because their tracking wasn't actually working. So again, every official account about how that was spread and what was going on has to take into account that the main organisation that was responsible did an inept job. And I'm kind of guessing I know why. Now, EcoHealth Alliance, it turns out, had also been doing research with Tulane University, and they were recipients of a $3.78 million grant, defence-funded grant as well. And Tulane University got 10% of that money. The other 90% went to the Wuhan Institute. Now, the Wuhan Institute, this was Tulane University, Gary Roberts, and the Wuhan Institute is obviously the laboratory which located in the city of Wuhan, where the COVID virus is first largely identified. There are actually the etymology. I would debate that because I think there are cases outside of China, but for the purpose of this video and the world's narrative, the disease came from Wuhan. And again, what we find is the idea that it came from any other sources other than bats was only put out by Peter Daznak of Ecohealth Alliance, the recipients of money, and he did this in a way where he didn't really explain his conflict of interest. And then he got a whole bunch of different academics who were also recipients of Ecohealth money, including Larry Roberts, to write a paper saying, no, the obvious source of COVID is bats. Except we now know that that's actually complete bollocks, and we're now in this sort of weird denial world where people say, "Oh, there are two dominant theories. We don't really know with COVID. It's very important to understand when you make a vaccine dealing with infectious disease. Ground zero is very important to know, and yet what we're being told is, we don't really know where the disease came from. But there are two prominent theories. One is it came from bats and outside of Wuhan, 600 miles away. That again, there is no case of disease between 600 miles and Wuhan. It's just boom, boom, straight jump from point A to B, which vector-wise is just nonsense. So as the theory goes, it's actually it lives permanently in the land of Absurdistan. The second theory is that it came from a laboratory, and again, when we apply the principles of Occam's razor, it would seem to be the case. Now, again, epidemiology it's an interesting thing because the gene sequencing matches up very much with what was going on in Wuhan, but we also do have epidemiology outbreaks of COVID appearing in water supplies in NATO-held countries and in America. But again, we won't go down that area. But it is sufficient to say that we know there was, and again, the quibble, this is the quibble, they're backwards and forwards, they're doing gain function, they're not, no, it's called something else. But the main thing was they were trying to make COVID stronger, and they were doing that by basically making a chimera. So remember again, when you look at Ebola and we look at the 2014 two variants, and one of the variants is very concerning because they had airborne contagions that could operate in cool environments, all these things that we were not normally used to seeing with Ebola. And again, we find with COVID, we've got spike genes and proteins that, and I won't say because I'm not a scientist, but from what I'm reading from mainstream articles and peer review, was it had characteristics of, in this version of COVID, variant of COVID, of both the herpes and various other diseases that shouldn't really be in a COVID virus, but they are there. And again, when you read articles when they're looking about the symptoms of long COVID and how it helps enact the herpes complex, which by the way is also very, again, there was a lot of noise made about people saying, 5G causes COVID. Well, no, it doesn't. But what the bit where people are getting smarmy and thinking, how silly these people believe that COVID causes 5G. No, it doesn't. But 5G attacks any form of immunology. And again, we see with herpes, that's a very good way to actually reactivate the herpes virus with electromagnetic stimulation. And it's very important because basically the herpes virus is also one of the precursors to neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's. So in terms of diseases it kills over a long period of time and actually targets the old, and that's the worst thing about whether it's the vaccines of COVID, I don't know. But what we're seeing is now a lot of people that are dying, apparently of issues that they already had there, but something has sort of woken it up. And again, when we look at this Jewish herpes, it's like, well, that potential, if you've been exposed to the herpes virus and there's been electromagnetic stimulation, it could actually basically wake it up. And every time it wakes up, you just get a little bit closer. The chances of you actually getting Alzheimer's becomes a little bit more intense. So the second case I said we got is the Tulane. Again, this whole theory is put up by Gary Roberts as one of the Tulane University, and there was a lot of claims at the time saying, no, back to the Ebola. It's like no, Tulane University wasn't making vaccines and they didn't have defence, and that was being taken off the internet and was being fact checked. But even before that, the COVID occurred, I had been screenshotting stuff, so I'm absolutely know for a fact that actually yes, Tulane University was doing vaccine work with the Department of Defence, and it did orientate around Ebola, and it was being carried out in those three particular places where the disease all broke out. This is third case, as I said, this is the third case where we find an outbreak, which is very, very strange in terms of what the authorities are saying one moment, what they're saying the next, to the point that the stories that you're reading in the newspapers are schizophrenic. It's like one sentence is literally the following sentence is contradicting the first one. So we now have three cases: Africa and Ebola, Wuhan Institute, and finally the third one, where third time round, where Tulane University has been connected to very, very dodgy infectious diseases, which look like the idea is that they're not doing countering disease infection, they're doing bioweapons research. And again, as we know, this sort of stuff is the Sunshine Project pointed out this was actually happening in that was 1998. Very, very sad, very interesting case. Go and have a look it up. I'm very sad about what happened to that. They got the funding cut off, and then that information, so people have forgotten about it. But there was this whole thing during the 80s and the 90s where the US Department of Defense was spending massive amounts of money on biowarfare, and they were contracting it all across throughout the world and throughout Eastern Europe, Asia, New Zealand, Australasia, even go down to Antarctica, Plum Island. And the game, not it's Plum Island, Palmer's Island. Plum Island is one of these places that constantly has, outbreaks and accidents, again, often involving the rhesus monkeys. And there are many places throughout the United States that you will actually see. The issue is it's not necessarily have to be conspiracy theory, but when you look at the highly number of incidences where diseases have broken out, accidents have occurred in the lab or they've broken out of the laboratory because of the sheer volume, it becomes really scary. And it should really be, in some ways, what we should be talking about the Wuhan, regardless of whether it actually was responsible for COVID, is what were they doing in their laboratory? And we're not having a conversation about why do they need to be making a disease stronger than it was? And again, why would you transport, having originally said officially, the monkeys were travelling with not one infectious diseases, but three. So the issue about, again, when you get told about the issue of vaccines is we live in this world where people are, oh no, vaccines are terrible, oh no, vaccines are magical. They're not. It's all about how you utilise them. And in the case of vaccines, one of the issues we always have to risk, Robert Webb's Webster Immunology Wing at Otago University is named after him, and he's St Jude's Hospital. But he talks about bad vaccines, and this is where vaccines are being applied incorrectly, or they create a potential for cross-contamination. And again, running around with a truck for monkeys with three types of infectious diseases seems like a really good way to get cross-contamination to occur. And not vaccinations, but just the infectious. That disease comes in contact with that disease, and that's how the cross-contamination occurs, because each of the vaccine has a little bit of the disease, but if it gets exposed to another disease, and this is the whole thing, like during wintertime, they say, if you get a shot of a vaccine, give yourself like 4 or 5 weeks before you can get another shot of something else, because if you don't, at that point, before your immunology system has a chance to adapt to the original thing, it's quite vulnerable. So when then gets exposed to another virus, you then get your cross-contamination or hybridization. So again, when we look at a lot of the questions of the COVID variants, one of the reasons I speculate, quite frankly saying this, speculating, that there are so many variants is that because the volume of people around the world was so large and the vaccines didn't get to people quick enough, and they were actually kind of using the wrong vaccines because at that stage the COVID had mutated, they themselves were causing cross-contaminations, which were then creating other hybrids. And I think that's the reason why there are so many variants of the COVID, because it's the sheer level of cross-contamination. And so it's not an issue about vaccines good or bad, but it's a question of protocols were not really listened to, and people weren't getting very educated about the fact that there is a right way to vaccinate and a wrong way. It's not just all vaccines good, all vaccines are bad. And these, unfortunately, in this, the conversation we're having on the subject, it's very hard to talk to people about, like, saying, can we have an adult conversation? Can we try and pretend that we're not actually 5 years old and believe in magic anymore? And that the world is not all full of demons and boogie monsters, and that science is not the new religion. And of course, it works the other way as well. But my basic point is, we are not really understanding what bioweapons are, or how prevalent they are, or how widespread the funding is. And again, because all this funding is going into academia, suddenly academia goes, oh no, we don't want to talk about, but vaccines are great, wonderful, we're not going to bite the hand that feeds us. And yet that may be exactly what's basically happened here. So I'm going to be following that story, and there are some other diseases popping up around the place. So I will be following the story for a little bit, because I think it could be quite interesting. But of course, we also kind of get into this weird world where, I'm wondering to kind of think, was this just another story that's been put out to distract people away from the Trump administration and the Epstein, and again, the breadcrumbs to find from Tulane University to Peter Daznak, Ecohealth, and the Biden, blah, blah, blah. It's pretty kind of almost a bit too easy. So I was wondering, was this like just a deny, detract, and deflect kind of situation, as we see what happened with the Epstein case? But it just makes me remind people, like, this whole world was like, all the whole people who believed in Donald Trump, they're vaccine deniers. Well, okay, not quite the case, because let's remember the Pfizer vaccine, which is the one that's causing so much problems. And again, I'm not anti-vaccine, but I did not want to touch Pfizer. I thought they were a very poor company. They had some of the highest, biggest fines for criminal records in the history. I wouldn't buy a used car of them. I'm certainly not going to take something that my life is dependent from them. But all of that was fast-tracked and approved by Donald Trump. And, this here at the same time he was going to bring in that woman Theron to work to head the FDA until she got busted because it turned out that all her magical diagnostic tools were all just snake oil. And, that's the kind of world we're not having a conversation about, can we have an adult conversation about how reliable the FDA is and how reliable CD is and how reliable the pharmaceutical industry is in general. But the point is, Donald Trump, he was the one that said, "Oh no, we will give the indemnity to the vaccine companies, and they don't show us what's actually in the ingredients." These are all things which are just not normal. As consumers, we should not be letting this happen or accepting that it's normalised. It's a really slippery, slidey, nasty land. But it wasn't just Donald Trump, because across the realm in England, you had Boris Johnson was again his version of the way the COVID response. So it was again, we're not denying the COVID, we're denying the response and what actually happened to the vaccine process. Instead of coming up with making a vaccine that would, give you a level of confidence enough that I'd, take a jab, because I've taken many jabs and many vaccines. I'm not anti-vaccine. I didn't want to do it that way because I thought their science was scary as hell. And we must remember, in the case of Boris Johnson and the SAGE, which is the Scientific Age Group Advisory Group, SAGE is a very high level, body made of top scientists, but they all mutineered under Boris Johnson because half of them were saying that Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson's advisor, was actually changing all this, making the response that was all about what the pharmacies wanted to make money and not about actual science. And so half of them actually walked away. So again, this idea that that the whole vaccine process was good or bad, it's more complicated than that. The question was, it wasn't necessarily a question about we shouldn't be making vaccines. It's a question of how we went about it and how the response to the crisis became an opportunity for profit, not for public health. And I think we'll just leave it there at that particular point, because I think I made all the points I want to make. But the issue is that we've come to a situation, and Donald Trump was a great example. He believed that the Wuhan came from a laboratory and he was blaming China, and because he said it, it instantaneously gave credence. Everyone went, "Oh no, that can't be true. Donald Trump's such a liar," But the reality was that we shouldn't have been listening to the politicians, and we shouldn't have been listening to public communications people and thinking that they were scientists. What we should have been doing is saying, well, actually, what are the checks and balances? Can we show that there is no conflicts of interest here? Are we getting advice from people that want to tell us the good and the bad, or are we just getting PR, public relations? And now we have another case of, I said, monkeys breaking out, and I wonder whether it's just going to be, it's just another, that story will fade away, because it again reminds me it's almost got a duplicate scenario to a case that occurred in 2015 of monkeys breaking out. And you almost wonder, is this whole thing just staged as a deflection? But if it's not, and we start to see cases actually breaking out, and again, I've also talked about infectious diseases involving insects and some of the things that are concerning me were there, but I am going to be paying a bit closer attention to this one, because because of when I follow the money trail, it leads me back to the usual suspects. Anyway, have a good day, and this is going to be my Deadline TV, the Peter Daznak, World Health Organization, Tulane University defense funding of bioweapons and disease infectious research that is of the sketchiest nature possible.